The Homeowners Association, HOA, thought they had one. 96 brand-new houses stood proudly on what was once an empty stretch of land, now a thriving community with neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and driveways lined with fancy cars. Families laughed, children played, and neighbors gathered for barbecues. It was perfect, too perfect. But then, the letters arrived. Each homeowner, from the proud new residents of Willow Creek Drive to the well-to-do folks on Oak Ridge Lane, received a letter in the mail. The contents were simple but devastating. You are trespassing on private property. You have 30 days to vacate or face legal consequences. Panic spread like wildfire. People called the HOA president, demanding answers. The board members, usually full of confidence, now sat in stunned silence, staring at the proof, the undeniable truth. The land did not belong to the HOA. It never had. A man had tricked them into building an entire neighborhood on his land. And now, he was ready to spring his trap. For years earlier, Tom Gallagher stood at the edge of his 100-acre property, watching a group of men in expensive suits pacing around with clipboards. He had owned this land for years, but no one had paid much attention to it before. Now these rich folks wanted it bad. He had heard the stories. The Willow Creek HOA had a reputation for swallowing up land, squeezing out small owners, and turning everything into a strict, rule-following suburban paradise. They built fancy neighborhoods, forced people into paying ridiculous fees, and controlled everything from mailbox color to how high the grass could grow. Tom was a simple man. He didn't like HOAs, and he definitely didn't like being pushed around. The HOA's president, Richard Langford, strutted up to him, flashing a polished, fake smile. "Mr. Gallagher," he said smoothly, "we're here to discuss the future of this land." "I own this land," Tom replied. "Ain't no future to discuss." Langford chuckled, like he was talking to a clueless old man. Yes, but surely you understand, this land is perfect for development. We could offer you a generous price." Tom already knew their trick. They would buy up land, push out anyone who didn't sell, and if someone refused, they'd find legal loopholes or political favors to take it anyway. He had seen it happen before. So, instead of arguing, he did something different. He agreed. "Well, I might be open to selling," Tom said, scratching his chin, "but only if the deal is right." Langford's eyes gleamed with greed. "Oh, I'm sure we can make that happen." Tom knew exactly what he was doing. He spent the next year pretending to negotiate, dragging things out with legal paperwork, surveys, and pointless meetings. While the HOA thought they were winning, Tom was preparing something they would never see coming. When the time was right, he made an offer they couldn't refuse. He proposed a complex land lease agreement buried in hundreds of pages of paperwork, filled with tiny clauses and legal loopholes. On the surface, it looked like he was selling them the land, but in reality, he was only loaning it to them. And the best part? The lease expired the moment they finished construction. The HOA, blinded by its hunger for expansion, signed everything without reading the fine print. They thought they had outsmarted Tom, but Tom had outsmarted them. As construction crews moved in, clearing trees, pouring concrete, and building roads, Tom watched with quiet satisfaction. He let them spend millions of dollars transforming his land into a perfect little community. For years, the HOA bragged about their newest development. They hosted grand opening events, invited important city officials, and even sold the houses at premium prices. People flocked in, eager to live in the best neighborhood in town. And Tom? He just waited until the final house was built, until every driveway was filled, every home decorated, and every streetlight shining bright, until they had invested everything into his land. Then he struck. The letters were sent. The legal teams were ready. And now, the entire HOA was on the verge of collapse. But Tom wasn't finished yet, because this was just the beginning. Panic gripped the neighborhood like a vice. Residents clutched the letters in shaking hands, their dream homes suddenly feeling like ticking time bombs. Some refused to believe it. Others bombarded the HOA office with calls, demanding answers. Richard Langford, the HOA president, stood in his office, his perfect white teeth clenched so hard they might crack. He stared at the legal documents in front of him, rereading the same paragraph over and over, hoping he had misread it. He hadn't. Tom Gallagher still owned everything. The roads, the sidewalks, the driveways, even the land under every house. It was all his. And now, the lease was up. Langford slammed his fist against his desk. No, no, this is impossible, he roared, but deep down he knew the truth. He had been played. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do about it. Meanwhile, Tom sat on his old wooden porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the sun set over his land. The land they thought they had stolen. His phone rang. He already knew who it was. With a smirk, he answered. Richard, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. You think this is funny? Langford spat. You're trying to ruin people's lives, Gallagher. What kind of game are you playing? Tom chuckled. Oh, this ain't a game, Rich. This is justice. Langford's voice lowered, dripping with desperation. Listen, we can work something out. You can't just evict 96 families. Not my problem, Tom said. You build on my land. And the contract you signed says you don't own a single inch of it. Langford went silent. Tom, let the moment stretch. I'll tell you what, though, Tom continued. I ain't unreasonable. I'll give y'all a choice. Langford perked up. I'm listening. You can buy the land. Fair and square. No tricks, no leases, just a good old-fashioned purchase. Langford exhaled in relief. Okay, how much? Tom's smirk widened. $100 million. Silence. Then, Langford exploded. That's robbery. That's what it costs, Tom said, cutting him off. You want it? Pay up. Langford sputtered. We don't have that kind of money. Well then, Tom said, y'all better start packing. The next morning, HOA board members gathered in a state of pure chaos. Some were still in denial, others scrambling for solutions. There has to be a way out of this, one board member said, flipping through contracts. There isn't, another muttered. We signed it. We didn't even read half of it. Langford sat at the head of the table, gripping his forehead. He had built his career on being the smartest man in the room. But Tom Gallagher had made him look like a fool. Then, one of the board members hesitated before speaking. We could take this to court. Langford snapped his head up. Yes, we could fight it. No judge will let this stand. We have hundreds of homeowners at risk. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. Langford sat up straighter. Yes, a lawsuit. They could stall Tom in court, delay the eviction, keep everything tied up in legal battles until they could figure out a way to take the land. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all they had. A week later, the HOA filed a lawsuit against Tom. They claimed his lease was a trick, that he had deceived them, that the homes belonged to the people who bought them, and no old man with a clever contract should be able to rip it all away. It was their last hope, but Tom had been waiting for this. The moment the case hit the courts, Tom's lawyers struck back. They weren't just defending him. They were attacking, and the HOA had no idea what was coming. Because Tom had one more card to play, and when he revealed it, the entire neighborhood was going to collapse like a house of cards. The courtroom was packed. Residents of Willow Creek sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale with worry. The HOA's board members sat in a row, stiff and grim. Richard Langford, their fearless leader, tapped his pen against the table, his jaw tight. On the other side of the room, Tom Gallagher sat back in his chair, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Hayes, was flipping through her notes with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. The judge, a gray-haired woman with an unforgiving stare, banged her gavel. Let's get started. Langford's lawyer, a man in an expensive suit, stood first. Your Honor, this case is simple. Mr. Gallagher tricked the HOA into signing a lease agreement that no reasonable person would expect. He is attempting to evict 96 families from their homes they legally purchased. We are asking the court to declare his contract fraudulent and grant us rightful ownership of the land. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some residents nodded, their hope rekindled. Then Valerie stood. Your Honor, she said, her voice cool and sharp, this case isn't about fraud. It's about greed. The HOA built without doing their due diligence. They signed every document willingly. They ignored the fine print. And now, because Mr. Gallagher outsmarted them, they want the court to save them from their own stupidity. Gasps filled the courtroom. Langford's face darkened. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Hayes, please watch your tone." "Of course, Your Honor," Valerie said smoothly. Then she pulled out a thick folder. "I'd like to submit Exhibit I, the full contract signed by the HOA." The judge flipped through the pages. After a moment, she sighed. "Mr. Langford," she said, peering at him over her glasses. "This contract clearly states that the land was only leased, not sold, and that once construction was completed, ownership would revert back to Mr. Gallagher. Did you not read this?" Langford's lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, the wording is deceptive. No reasonable person would expect." "But it's legal," the judge interrupted. Langford's lips pressed into a thin line. "Furthermore," Valerie continued, "the HOA made millions selling homes on land they never owned. They forced homeowners to pay HOA fees, issued fines, and control their lives on property they had no right to." The courtroom buzzed. Homeowners started whispering to each other, the realization settling in. They had been paying fees to a group of people who didn't even own the land. Langford could feel the room turning against him. He had to act fast, so he did something desperate. He stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "if you allow Mr. Gallagher to go through with this, you will be destroying an entire community. 96 families will be homeless. Children will lose their schools. Jobs will be lost. These are real people." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some homeowners even clapped. But Tom wasn't fazed. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's real sad, Rich," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you weren't thinking about them when you tried to steal my land, were you?" Silence. Langford's face turned red. The judge sighed. "I'll review all the documents. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." She banged her gavel. The moment she did, chaos erupted. Homeowners rushed toward the HOA board, demanding answers. Some screamed at Langford. Others turned to Tom, begging for mercy. Tom stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Y'all should have thought about this before you got greedy," he muttered as he walked out. But just before he left the courtroom, Langford caught up to him. His eyes were wild. "This isn't over, Gallagher," he hissed. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're messing with." Tom just chuckled. "See you in court, Rich." Then he walked away, leaving Langford standing there, fists clenched, rage burning in his eyes. But Langford wasn't going to lose everything. No, if the law wouldn't save him, he would find another way. That night, Willow Creek was restless. The once proud neighborhood was now a place of whispers and fear. People sat on their porches, talking in hushed voices. Some paced in their living rooms, reading their eviction notices over and over, as if they might suddenly disappear. But inside the HOA's private office, hidden from the rest of the community, Richard Langford was plotting. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. His board members sat in silence, their eyes darting between each other, waiting for someone to speak. One of them, a thin man named Charles, finally broke the silence. Maybe we should negotiate with him." Langford snapped his head toward him. "Negotiate?" he growled. "Gallagher doesn't want a deal. He wants revenge." Charles swallowed hard. "But we don't have a choice. We can't pay $100 million. And if we lose in court, we're finished." Langford clenched his jaw. "We're not losing." A woman named Denise, another board member, shifted uncomfortably. "Richard, the judge is going to rule in his favor. You saw her face in court. She knows we messed up." Langford's fists tightened. He refused to accept defeat. He had spent years building his power. He had crushed smaller HOAs, pushed out homeowners who didn't follow his rules, and expanded Willow Creek into the most powerful community in the city. And he wasn't about to let some old farmer take it all away. Then an idea hit him. A dark, dangerous idea. "What if the land wasn't his anymore?" he muttered. The room went silent. Denise frowned. "What do you mean?" Langford turned to the group, his eyes gleaming. "We find something, anything, that lets us take it from him. We check old deeds, zoning laws, city records. If there's even a tiny legal loophole that lets us claim the land, We use it. But what if there isn't one? Charles asked, nervous. Langford's lips curled into a slow, cold smile. Then we make one. The next morning, Tom Gallagher sat on his porch, sipping his usual sweet tea. The sun was rising, golden light spilling across his land. Everything was going exactly as he planned. He had known from the start that Langford would try to fight back, and he also knew that the HOA never played fair. So, he was already prepared for whatever dirty trick they were about to pull. Just as he took another sip, he saw a black SUV creeping up his long dirt driveway. He smirked. Right on time. The car rolled to a stop, and out stepped 3 men in suits. The middle one, a short man with a briefcase, looked around nervously. He was flanked by 2 towering men who looked more like bodyguards than lawyers. Tom didn't move. He just waited. The short man cleared his throat. Mr. Gallagher? Tom tipped his hat. That's me. The man forced a smile. I'm Robert Miller, representing the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I figured, Tom said. What can I do for you? Miller straightened his tie. We've uncovered some issues with your land deed. There are some discrepancies in the county records, and it appears your ownership may not be as solid as you think. Tom chuckled. That's so. Miller nodded. Yes. And until this is resolved, your claim over this land is, how do I put this, in question. Tom let the silence stretch. Then he slowly stood up, his chair creaking as he pushed it back. The 2 bodyguards stiffened. Tom glanced at them, amused. Y'all bring muscle 'cause you thought I'd be scared? Miller swallowed. And no, Mr. Gallagher, this is just a friendly discussion. Tom took a step forward. Miller took one back. Then Tom leaned in, his voice calm but dangerous. I've owned this land for 30 years. My name's been on that deed longer than your boss has had his teeth whitened. Miller flinched. I know exactly what you're doing, Tom continued. You're digging through old papers, hoping to find some technicality that lets you steal what's mine. Miller opened his mouth, but Tom cut him off. Ain't gonna work. The wind rustled through the trees. The bodyguards shifted uncomfortably. Then Tom smiled. But tell Langford I said thanks. Miller blinked. For what? Tom's smile widened. For making this even easier. Miller looked confused, then nervous. Without another word, he hurried back to the SUV, motioning for the bodyguards to follow. They jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and sped away. Tom watched them go, shaking his head. He had already expected Langford to pull a stunt like this. And just like before, he had set a trap. A trap Langford had just walked straight into. Richard Langford sat at the head of the HOA's meeting table, gripping his pen so tightly it might snap. His legal team sat around him, their faces uncertain. Across from him, Robert Miller, the lawyer he had sent to Tom Gallagher's house, looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Langford leaned forward. Tell me you have something. Miller shifted in his seat. Sir, there's a problem. Langford's nostrils flared. A problem? Miller hesitated. Gallagher knows what we're doing. Langford clenched his jaw. Of course he does. He's not stupid. But do we have something? Anything. Miller swallowed. We found a possible loophole. Langford's eyes sharpened. Go on. Miller cleared his throat. There was an old zoning restriction from nearly 50 years ago. Back then, this land was designated as agricultural only. Technically, that means the neighborhood should have never been built here in the first place. Langford's lips curled. Finally. But, Miller continued, his voice uneasy. Gallagher must have known about it. He didn't seem even a little surprised when I mentioned deed issues. And, sir, Miller hesitated. Langford narrowed his eyes. What? Miller exhaled. I think we're walking into a trap. Silence. Then Langford laughed. A cold, humorless laugh. Oh, don't be ridiculous, he said. Gallagher's just an old farmer with a grudge. If there's a way to use this against him, we're taking it. Miller didn't argue, but the feeling in his gut told him this was a very bad idea. The next morning, Langford wasted no time. He gathered the HOA's lawyers and stormed into the county office. He demanded an emergency meeting with the zoning board, pushing every favor he had to make it happen. Within hours, he was sitting in front of the county commissioner, a bald man with a thick mustache named Gerald Price. Langford handed him the documents. As you can see, he said smoothly, This land was never legally converted for residential use, meaning Gallagher's lease should be invalid. If we can challenge his ownership, we can reclaim the land for the homeowners. Price frowned as he flipped through the papers. Langford leaned forward. This neighborhood was built illegally. If we file a petition, we could seize this land. Price sighed, rubbing his forehead. Langford, do you realize what you're saying? Langford smirked. I'm saying we can win. Price glanced down at the papers again. His expression hardened. Then he chuckled. Langford stiffened. Something funny? Price looked up, shaking his head. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Langford's smirk faltered. What? Price slid a different document across the table. Gallagher filed a zoning correction 5 years ago. It was approved and officially converted into mixed-use property. That means the neighborhood was built legally. Langford's stomach twisted. No, he said, shaking his head. No, that's not possible. We searched the records. Price folded his hands. You must have searched the wrong ones. Because Gallagher's paperwork is airtight. You just walked into a trap. Langford felt his blood run cold. He had spent days digging, thinking he had finally found a way to destroy Gallagher's claim. But in reality, Gallagher had led him right to it. Price leaned back, smirking. I have a feeling Tom's enjoying this. Langford shot up from his chair, slamming his hands on the table. This isn't over. Price sighed. It is. Langford stormed out of the office, rage burning through his veins. He would not lose to Tom Gallagher. If the law wouldn't take him down, then it was time for something else. Something personal. That night, Tom sat on his porch as a light drizzle began to fall. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the raindrops tap against the roof. He knew Langford had gone to the county office, and he knew exactly what he would find. A slow, satisfied grin spread across his face. The trap had worked, but as he reached for his glass of tea, something caught his eye. A car parked far down the road. Its headlights were off, just sitting there, watching. Tom's grin faded. Langford wasn't done, and Tom knew whatever came next wouldn't be legal. Tom Gallagher watched the car parked at the end of his long driveway. It was late, too late for visitors. The headlights were off, the engine was silent, but he could feel it. Someone was watching him. He didn't panic. Instead, he slowly set his glass of tea down on the wooden table beside him. Then, without breaking eye contact with the car, he reached under his chair. His fingers found the smooth handle of his old shotgun, resting exactly where it always was. Tom didn't stand up right away. He let the moment stretch, watching, waiting, and then the car's engine roared to life. Tires spun against the wet gravel as it peeled away, disappearing down the road. Tom exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the gun. Langford was getting desperate, and desperate men did stupid things. The next morning, Tom drove into town. He wasn't afraid. He had seen men like Langford before. They didn't fight fair, but they also weren't as smart as they thought they were. He parked his truck outside the sheriff's office, stepping out into the cool morning air. Inside, Sheriff Mark Tully sat at his desk, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. He was a burly man with tired eyes and a thick mustache. Tully looked up. Tom. Tom tipped his hat. Sheriff. Tully folded the paper. Heard about the lawsuit. Langford's throwing a fit. Tom chuckled. More than a fit. He sent a car to watch my house last night. Tully frowned, setting his coffee down. You get a look at the driver? Tom shook his head. Didn't need to. I know it's him or one of his boys. Tully leaned back. You want me to pay Langford a visit? Tom scratched his chin. Not yet. I just want to know if he's dumb enough to try something more than just watching to. Tully sighed, rubbing his forehead. I don't like this, Tom. Langford's got connections. He's got money, lawyers, and enough pull to make life miserable for folks. Tom smirked. Yeah, but he ain't got brains. Tully chuckled, but his expression remained serious. Be careful. If he crosses the line, call me. Tom nodded. Will do. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Langford was seething. His plan to use zoning laws had failed. His lawyers were useless. And now, homeowners were turning against him. Ever since the court hearing, word had spread through the neighborhood. Residents were furious that they had been paying HOA fees for land they didn't even own. Some were even talking about suing the HOA. Langford couldn't let that happen. So he called an emergency meeting. The board members sat stiffly around the table, avoiding eye contact. Langford slammed a stack of papers onto the table. "We're running out of options," he snapped. "Gallagher has us cornered. And if we lose this lawsuit, this HOA is finished." Denise, one of the board members, sighed. "Maybe we should offer him something?" Langford's head snapped toward her. "Offer him what? He wants $100 million. We don't have that." Charles, the thin board member, shifted in his seat. "Then what do you suggest?" Langford's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "We make Gallagher regret ever messing with us." The room went silent. Denise frowned. "What are you saying?" Langford leaned forward, his voice low. "We hit him where it hurts." That night, Tom was sitting in his living room when he heard a distant explosion. The ground shook. The windows rattled. Tom shot up from his chair. Something was wrong. He grabbed his shotgun and bolted outside. The night air was thick with the smell of smoke. Off in the distance, near the far end of his land, he could see the orange glow of fire. His old barn was burning. Tom's stomach tightened. He ran toward it, his boots pounding against the dirt. The flames roared, swallowing the old wooden structure in seconds. Sparks shot into the sky, smoke billowing into the night. By the time he got there, it was too late. The barn was gone. Tom clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around his shotgun. He didn't need to guess who did this. Langford had just declared war. Tom took a slow, deep breath, staring into the flames. He had tried to play this the smart way, the legal way. But Langford wanted to get dirty? Fine. Tom would get dirty too. Because what Langford didn't know was that this wasn't just some old barn. This barn held something that would destroy him. And Tom had just been given the perfect reason to use it. Tom Gallagher stood in front of the burning barn, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. The fire crackled, embers swirling into the night sky. His land, his home, had just been attacked. He had known Richard Langford would get desperate. He had expected dirty tactics. But this was personal. Tom's mind was already working. The barn itself didn't matter. It was old, barely used. But inside that barn, that's where things got interesting. Because that barn had been hiding a secret. And now, thanks to Langford's arrogance, Tom had the perfect excuse to use it. By the time the fire department arrived, the barn was nothing but smoking rubble. Sheriff Tully pulled up a few minutes later, stepping out of his cruiser, his expression grim. He adjusted his belt, taking in the mess. "Well, hell." Tom nodded. "Yep." Tully let out a slow sigh. "You sure it was Langford?" Tom didn't answer. He just looked at Tully. The sheriff exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "All right, I'll ask some questions. But you and I both know Langford's got enough lawyers to keep himself out of trouble." Tom smirked. "That's fine." Tully frowned. "Fine? You don't look nearly as mad as I expected." Tom shrugged. "That's 'cause I ain't mad." Tully gave him a skeptical look. "Oh." Tom turned back toward the ruins of his barn, his smile widening. "I'm just thinking how much fun I'm about to have." Tully groaned. "Tom, whatever's going through that head of yours, don't do it." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Sheriff. I'm just setting things right." The next morning, Richard Langford sat in his pristine office, sipping his coffee. His phone rang. He answered smoothly, Langford speaking. A deep, familiar voice rumbled through the receiver. "Rich." Langford's grip on the phone tightened. "Tom." Langford smirked. "Tom, how's that barn of yours?" "Warm enough." A long pause. Then, "Oh, I ain't worried about the barn, Rich. But I just thought you should know." Tom's voice dropped lower. "Deadly. You burned the wrong building." Langford's smirk twitched. "What?" Tom chuckled. "See that old barn? That was bait." Langford sat up straighter. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You just did me a huge favor," Tom continued. "Because now I get to use what I've really been hiding." Langford's stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. Tom was supposed to be furious. But instead, he sounded excited. Langford swallowed. "Gallagher, listen." Tom cut him off. "See you real soon, Rich." Click. The call went dead. Langford slowly set his phone down, his palms suddenly damp. Tom wasn't scared. He wasn't running. And worst of all, he was smiling. Langford had no idea what he had just unleashed. Richard Langford sat frozen, gripping the edge of his desk. Tom Gallagher's words echoed in his head. "You burned the wrong building." What the hell did that mean? Langford had ordered the barn to be torched to send a message, to show Tom that he was willing to play dirty. But now, it felt like he had walked straight into a trap. He grabbed his phone and called Charles, one of his most loyal board members. The line barely rang before Charles picked up. "Richard," Charles said, his voice laced with panic. "We have a problem." Langford's stomach tightened. "What now?" Charles took a shaky breath. "I don't know what Gallagher's planning, but people in the neighborhood are talking. He's been seen all over town, talking to old friends, calling in favors. And get this, he met with a reporter." Langford's blood went cold. A reporter? Tom wasn't just fighting him in court. He was about to drag this entire thing into the public eye. Langford slammed his fist on his desk. "Find out who the reporter is. Now." Charles hesitated. "That's not all." Langford exhaled sharply. "What else?" "Gallagher also visited the county records office this morning, and whatever he was looking for, he found it." Langford's vision blurred for a moment. Tom had something big, and he had just set it loose. Across town, Tom Gallagher sat at a diner, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. Across from him sat Lisa Carter, an investigative journalist for the biggest newspaper in the state. Lisa was young, sharp-eyed, and known for one thing: exposing corruption. She leaned forward, her pen tapping against her notepad. "All right, Mr. Gallagher, tell me everything." Tom smiled. He took a slow sip of coffee before speaking. "Well now, Lisa, where do I start?" And then he told her everything. About the HOA's dirty tactics. About how they had built about how Richard Langford had tried to cheat him, then burned down his barn to send a message. Lisa scribbled furiously, her eyes widening with every word. "This is unbelievable." Tom chuckled. "Oh, I ain't even gotten to the good part yet." Lisa leaned in. "What's the good part?" Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Thick, filled with documents. Lisa frowned. "What's this?" Tom slid it across the table. "These," he said, tapping the folder, "are records from 50 years ago. They show that before this land was mine, it belonged to a man named Walter Langford." Lisa's pen froze midair. "Wait, Langford? As in Richard Langford?" Tom's grin widened. "His grandfather," he said. Lisa's eyes darted down to the documents. She flipped through them, scanning old land deeds, contracts, and letters. "I don't get it. What does this have to do with?" Then she saw it. One tiny detail buried deep in the paperwork. Lisa's breath hitched. She looked up at Tom, stunned. "Are you telling me that Richard Langford's own family lost the rights to this land decades ago?" Tom leaned back, smiling. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa's heart raced. This wasn't just a land dispute. This was scandal. If this got out, it wouldn't just destroy Langford's case in court. It would ruin him. She grabbed her phone. "I need to make a few calls." Tom nodded. "You do that." As Lisa hurried out of the diner, Tom sat back and took another sip of his coffee. Langford thought he had power, but power meant nothing if the truth was against you. And now, Tom had the truth, and he was about to burn Langford's world to the ground. Meanwhile, back in the Willow Creek HOA office, Langford was spiraling. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it, expecting it to be Charles. But it wasn't. It was an unknown number. Frowning, he answered. "Who is this?" A smooth voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Langford, my name is Lisa Carter. I'm a journalist." Langford's heart stopped. Lisa continued. "I'm working on a story about the land your HOA built on, and about your family's history with it." Langford's breath hitched. Lisa's voice sharpened. "I'd love to get your side before we print." Langford felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Tom Gallagher had just fired the first shot, and now it was war. Richard Langford gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. A journalist. Tom Gallagher had gone to the press. Lisa Carter was waiting on the other end of the call, giving him a chance to explain himself. But Langford knew what this was, a trap. If he said anything wrong, she'd print it. If he refused to comment, she'd print that too. Either way, his reputation, his power, was hanging by a thread. Langford forced his voice to stay calm. "I don't know what you think you have, Ms. Carter, but this land belongs to the HOA. We legally developed it, and this so-called scandal is nothing but a bitter old man stirring up trouble." Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made Langford's stomach drop. "I have county records proving that your grandfather lost ownership of that land decades ago." Langford swallowed. That's impossible." "It's not," Lisa said, her voice sharp. "I've seen the documents. Your grandfather defaulted on a government loan, and the land was seized. It was later auctioned off, legally, and Gallagher's family bought it. Which means—" Langford felt his pulse pounding. Lisa's next words came like a knife to the gut. "You built an entire neighborhood on land that never belonged to you. And now, you're trying to cover it up?" Langford's breathing turned shallow. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was exposure. This was humiliation. If Lisa printed this story, he'd be ruined. The homeowners would revolt. The lawsuit would be over before it even started. Langford tried to regain control. "Listen, Miss Carter," he said, forcing a chuckle. "You don't want to be dragged into this nonsense. Gallagher is lying to you." But Lisa cut him off. "I already verified the documents with the county office." Langford's throat tightened. Lisa's voice turned colder. "Would you like to give me a statement before we publish?" Langford's jaw clenched. His mind raced. He needed time. Time to think. Time to bury this story before it spread. He forced out a sigh. "I'll need to review those documents myself before I comment." Lisa's tone was skeptical. "You have 24 hours. Then she hung up. Langford slammed his phone on the desk. This couldn't be happening. Tom Gallagher had set him up from the start. And now, his carefully built empire was seconds away from crumbling. Across town, Tom Gallagher sat on his porch, watching the sky turn gold as the sun set over his land. The land that was his. He knew Langford was probably losing his mind right now, and he loved it. But Tom wasn't finished yet. He pulled out his own phone and made a call. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah." Tom smiled. "Hey there, Carl. You still got them drones you like flying?" Carl chuckled. "Sure do." "What?" Tom leaned back in his chair. "I got a job for you." Later that night, Richard Langford sat in his office, frantically flipping through county records, trying to find something, anything, that could save him. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. He was running out of time. Then his phone buzzed. A message. Langford frowned and picked it up. The message had no name, no number, just a single attachment. A video file. Langford hesitated. Then he clicked play. The screen flickered. At first, it was just darkness. Then, a bird's-eye view of his own house appeared. Langford's heart stopped. The footage zoomed in onto his front yard. His car. His security cameras. Someone had been watching him. Then, the camera panned over to a group of men standing outside his house. Langford's mouth went dry. He recognized them. They were the same men he had hired to set fire to Gallagher's barn. The video kept rolling. The men spoke in hushed tones. One of them even laughed, tossing a can of gasoline into the back of a truck. Langford's skin went ice cold. Then the screen glitched, and suddenly words appeared in bold white text. "I see everything. See you soon." Langford dropped his phone. His entire body shook. Gallagher had proof. And now, it wasn't just about the land anymore. Now, Langford could go to prison. Richard Langford's hands trembled as he stared at the message on his phone. "I see everything. See you soon." Tom Gallagher wasn't just fighting back. He was hunting him. Langford shot up from his desk, his mind racing. He needed to fix this before it was too late. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of his office, dialing a number he never thought he'd have to call. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "You better have a damn good reason for calling me this late, Langford." Langford swallowed. "Mason, we have a problem." Meanwhile, Tom Gallagher sat in his truck, parked at the edge of his land. The night was quiet, but he could feel the storm coming. He leaned back in his seat, glancing at his phone. Carl had sent him the full video footage, clear shots of Langford's hired men burning his barn down. Tom had everything he needed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. A slow smirk played on his lips. Langford had been fighting dirty from the start. Now it was Tom's turn. He had a number on his phone and brought it to his ear. "Lisa," he said when the reporter answered. "Hope you're ready to print, 'cause I just sent you something that'll make Langford wish he never got out of bed." Across town, Langford's SUV sped through the empty streets, heading toward the outskirts. He pulled up to a rundown auto shop, killed the engine, and stepped out. The place looked abandoned, but Langford knew better. He knocked twice on the rusted metal door. A slot slid open, and a pair of sharp eyes glared out. "Who the hell?" "It's Langford," he hissed. "Let me in." A pause. Then the door unlocked, and Langford was ushered inside. Mason Cutter stood in the dimly lit room, arms crossed. A mountain of a man, covered in faded tattoos and scars from a past he didn't talk about. "You look like hell," Mason muttered. Langford ran a hand through his hair. "I need your help." Mason smirked. "Yeah? That's funny, 'cause last time I saw you, you acted like you were too good to be seen with people like me." Langford gritted his teeth. "I don't have time for this." Mason leaned against a workbench. "Then start talking." Langford exhaled sharply. "Tom Gallagher. He's got proof, video proof. Tie me to the fire." Mason whistled. "Well, that's unfortunate." Langford clenched his fists. "I need it gone. I need him handled." Mason's smirk disappeared. "Handled?" Langford hesitated. He wasn't thinking straight. He was panicking, grasping at any lifeline. But he knew Mason wasn't the kind of man who asked twice. Langford took a shaky breath. "Yes, handled." Mason studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "It's going to cost you." Langford's stomach turned. "How much?" Mason grinned. "A whole lot more than you got." Tom Gallagher knew he was being followed. He had seen the headlights in his rearview mirror 5 minutes ago. Whoever was tailing him wasn't subtle. Tom didn't panic. Instead, he smiled. He tapped the brakes lightly, just enough to test them. The car behind him slowed. Tom chuckled. "Amateurs." Then he made a sharp right turn onto a dirt road, leading deeper into his land. The car hesitated, then followed. Tom's smile widened. "That's right. Come on in." The truck bounced over the uneven path, kicking up dust. The headlights behind him bobbed and swayed, struggling to keep up. Then, suddenly, Tom killed his lights. The world went dark. The car behind him panicked, tires screeching as the driver lost control for a moment. Tom hit the brakes hard, skidding to a stop. The other car nearly slammed into him, stopping just in time. Before they could react, Tom was already out of his truck, shotgun in hand. He aimed it directly at the windshield. The driver's door flew open. A man scrambled out, hands raised. Wait, don't shoot." Tom narrowed his eyes. "You got 5 seconds to tell me who sent you." The man swallowed hard. "Langford. It was Langford." Tom didn't lower the gun. "And what exactly did he tell you to do?" The man hesitated. Tom cocked the shotgun. All right, the man stammered. "I was just supposed to scare you. That's it. Just make you back off." Tom stepped closer. "You torched my barn?" The man shook his head. "No, I swear. I wasn't part of that." Tom studied him for a long moment. The guy was nervous, but he wasn't lying. Finally, Tom lowered the gun. "Get out of here," he said, "and tell Langford he just made his last mistake." The man didn't hesitate. He jumped into his car and tore off down the road. Tom exhaled, gripping the shotgun tighter. Langford wasn't just desperate anymore. He was dangerous, and that meant Tom had to end this. The next morning, Richard Langford was in his office when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Langford frowned and opened it. A video started playing. His guy, the one he sent to follow Gallagher. Panicked, begging, and Gallagher standing there, shotgun in hand. Langford's face went pale. Then, more text appeared on the screen. "I gave you every chance to walk away, Rich. Now it's my turn." Langford's breath hitched. Tom Gallagher was coming for him. And this time, he wasn't playing fair anymore. Richard Langford sat in his office, sweat beading on his forehead. The message on his phone was clear as day. Now it's my turn." Tom Gallagher wasn't backing down. Langford's mind raced. He had pushed too far. He thought he could outmaneuver an old farmer, use legal loopholes, intimidation, even violence to get what he wanted. But now, Gallagher was hunting him. Langford needed help. Fast. His hands trembled as he dialed Mason Cutter's number. It rang once. Twice. Then, "I was wondering when you'd call." Langford exhaled sharply. "I need this handled now." Mason chuckled. "You mean you need Gallagher gone?" Langford swallowed. He wasn't a killer. He had spent his whole career crushing people with contracts and lawsuits, not blood. But Tom Gallagher had him cornered. If the lawsuit didn't destroy him, the press would. If the press didn't, the homeowners would turn against him. And if none of those did, Gallagher would. Langford squeezed his eyes shut. I just need this to go away. Mason's voice turned dark. That's going to cost you. Langford ran a hand through his hair. I don't care. Just do it. Mason chuckled. Consider it done. That night, Tom Gallagher knew something was coming. He had been around long enough to know when a man like Langford was truly desperate. And desperate men didn't stop at threats. So he prepared. Tom sat in his barn-turned workshop, double-checking everything. The land around his house was wired with motion sensors. His hunting rifles were cleaned and loaded. His drones were charged and ready. Langford thought this was a fight about property. He had no idea. Tom was a man who built his life on this land, and no slick lawyer in a fancy suit was going to take it from him. A rumble of thunder echoed outside. A storm was rolling in. Tom smirked. Perfect. Then, movement on one of his monitors caught his eye. His security camera feed showed a black SUV rolling up his dirt road. Tom's grin widened. Right on time. Richard Langford wasn't in the car. Mason Cutter was. And he wasn't alone. 3 other men sat beside him. Rough-looking, the kind who didn't ask questions. They weren't here to scare Tom anymore. They were here to end him. Mason flicked off the SUV's headlights as they reached the outer edge of Tom's land. The road was rough, bouncing the car as they moved deeper into the dark. This old man really worth all this trouble? One of the men asked. Mason smirked. Langford's paying me a fortune to clean up his mess. And Gallagher? He's just an old farmer. Won't be hard. The men chuckled. They had no idea they were driving straight into a trap. Tom watched them from his porch. He could see their shapes in the darkness. He knew exactly what was about to happen, because they thought they were hunting him. But in reality, they had just walked into his land. His rules. His game. Tom calmly grabbed his radio. Carl, he said, his voice steady. Turn on the lights. The moment Mason's SUV reached the center of the property. Boom! Floodlights erupted, turning night into day. The SUV skidded to a stop, its tires spinning in the mud. The men inside cursed, shielding their eyes. And then, the sound of shotgun cocking echoed through the air. Mason Cutter barely had time to react before Tom's voice boomed from the porch. You boys lost. Mason squinted toward the house. Gallagher, let's talk. Tom smirked. Oh, I think we're past talking. Then, a warning shot. Boom. A shotgun blast exploded into the dirt near their feet, sending mud and gravel flying. The men jumped back, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Tom shook his head. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Mason clenched his jaw. You think you're some kind of cowboy? Tom's eyes narrowed. Nope. I just know my land, and I know exactly where you're standing. Then, a mechanical buzzing filled the air. Mason's head snapped up. Drones. 5 of them, all hovering just above them, each one equipped with cameras and high-powered spotlights. Mason's stomach dropped. He realized, too late, that they were being recorded. Every word, every move. Tom Gallagher had been waiting for this. Tom smirked. Smile, boys. The whole town's about to see who really started this fight. Mason's face twisted in rage. Langford's gonna... Tom cut him off. Langford. Tom chuckled. Oh, I wouldn't count on him. Then he whistled. And suddenly, lights flashed in the distance. More headlights. And the sound of sirens. Sheriff Tully's cruisers roared down the dirt road, kicking up dust as they surrounded the SUV. Mason froze. His men panicked, hands shooting up as deputies spilled out, guns drawn. Sheriff Tully stepped out last, shotgun resting over his shoulder. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Well, well, ain't this a sight? Mason Cutter's jaw clenched. He turned back toward Tom. You set us up. Tom grinned. Took you this long to figure that out? Mason glared. Langford won't let this slide. Tom chuckled. Oh, I know. That's why I saved the best part for last. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Seconds later, Richard Langford's face appeared. On every phone in town. Because Tom had just sent the footage, everything from a barn fire to the hit Langford put out, to every news station in the state. Mason's face drained of color. Sheriff Tully let out a low whistle. Welp. That's the end of that. Tom leaned against his shotgun, his grin never fading. Richard Langford was done. And this war? Tom Gallagher just won. By sunrise, it was over. Richard Langford's empire collapsed overnight. The footage Tom sent to the press spread like wildfire. Every news channel covered the scandal. How the mighty HOA president had built a neighborhood on stolen land, hired criminals, and tried to cover it all up with arson and violence. Langford tried to run, but he never even got the chance. By the time he left his house that morning, Sheriff Tully and a team of deputies were waiting. The moment he stepped onto his porch, "Richard Langford, you're under arrest." The cuffs clicked around his wrists before he could even protest. The town watched as their once powerful HOA president was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. Some homeowners cheered. Others shook their heads in disbelief. For years, Langford had controlled everything. He had set the rules, made the laws, crushed anyone who stood in his way. Now he was just another criminal in handcuffs. 2 weeks later, Willow Creek collapsed. Without Langford, the HOA crumbled. Lawsuits poured in from angry homeowners, demanding their money back. Some even walked away from their houses, unwilling to stay in a community built on lies. Developers pulled out. Investors vanished. And within a month, half the neighborhood was empty. Tom watched it all happen from a distance, a slow smile creeping onto his face. It wasn't just about winning. It was about teaching a lesson. People like Langford thought they could take whatever they wanted. They thought their money and power made them untouchable. But in the end, they were just fools walking into traps of their own making. And Tom, he was still here. His land was still his. And no HOA, no lawyer, no rich businessman in a fancy suit was ever going to take it away. One evening, Sheriff Tully pulled up to Tom's house. He stepped out, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Well, Gallagher, you sure as hell made a mess of things." Tom grinned. "I cleaned up a mess. Big difference." Tully leaned against his car. "So what now? You finally going to enjoy your peace and quiet?" Tom sipped his sweet tea, watching the sun set over his land. "Maybe," he said with a smirk. Tully snorted. "Yeah, sure, until the next poor fool tries to take what's yours." Tom just chuckled. Let them try, because if there was one thing everyone in town now knew, it was this: Tom Gallagher always has a trap waiting.